Welcome back to Kivumbi 2017. If you're just joining us, it is now 2 hours, 3 minutes since polling stations across the country opened for the fresh presidential election. A long-awaited day as Kenyans go back to the poll for an election that was nullified 2 months ago by the Supreme Court. We're keeping an eye on the situation all across the country as Jubilee's strongholds ensure they cast their ballot. But supporters in NASA strongholds have been asked to stay home and boycott the ballot by opposition leader Raila Odinga. The turnout across the country remains low in our spot check in many areas in the country, but no cases of violence reported just yet. Calm all across the country still remains. We'll be crossing over to our reporters in just a moment for more details, but for now, let me hand you over to my colleague Michael Gitonga with an able panel in studio this morning.
Thank you very much, Michelle, and I'll go straight to introducing the panelists that we have this morning, and I'll start with Nerima Wako, who's the Executive Director for Siasa Place. We also have Dr. Lutalala Mukwana, who's a lawyer, but also well-versed in matters politics, and Javas Bigambo, who's a governance expert. Ladies and gentlemen, thank you for joining us, and we've been observing what has been going on and basically the reports that we've been receiving so far. Let me start with you, Dr. Lutalala, on your comments on what we have seen so far.
Thanks, Michael. Good morning. And first of all, may I begin by appreciating the calmness that we are observing today. And this, I must give it to Honorable Raila to the extent that he asked his supporters to stay home and not go to the polling centers or appear to disrupt the ongoing of the elections. So I'm grateful that we have calmness, and I'm also grateful that Kenyans have decided that those who wish to go and vote, let them be. And those who do not wish to go and vote, let them be as well. I think that is a chord that has been struck, which is good for us in the country. And we really hope that that keeps on, because we must live and let live. That is where we ought to go as a country. Having said that, you'll notice that there are areas where voting has already begun, albeit slowly compared to the previous times. And there are areas where there's no voting at all. So what we are faced with, of course, at the end of this day, and once the results are tabulated and the results are communicated tomorrow, is, shall we remain Kenya? My prayer is that we remain so, because that's what we are.
All right.
Thank you.
Nerima, given that this, the political turmoil that we've gone through before we got to this day, Kenya was at a point where we felt we were at the brink of losing our peace. And, looking at the events today, would you say that there has been a shift and a change? It was expected that there may be violence, but so far, great to note that there has been no violence reported. It seems like everybody is happy to let whoever else have their democratic space.
Thank you for having me, Michael. I would have to say that there's a sense of calm. I remember also August 8th, I was here that morning, and coming in, the lines were massive when we were passing Nyayo Stadium. This time, even though there are not long lines, there is this sense of calm that I'm seeing around me and my family, and people sort of, as Professor has said, keeping to themselves. Even though necessarily they might not be on the same page, there seems to be a sense of respect. Those who do want to go vote have been allowed to go vote, and those who wish to remain at home are remaining at home. And for them, it's just a normal occurrence and another day. Okay. So I think it's a good transition.
It's a good transition. Javas, the truth of the matter is, after today, we still have a country. And looking at even the voting lines right now, we can clearly tell that it's a very divided country in terms of those who are going to vote and those who are not going to vote. There are those who've basically gone, but we still have a country tomorrow. Your thoughts on how this is going to play out, regardless of whether there's a president or no president? How does this play out after this?
Well, the late Nigerian author, Chinua Achebe, wrote his last book titled There Was a Country, to mirror perhaps, or part of, or to get some reflection from what he wrote. I would say there will be a country. Fact is that of all liberties and rights preserved under the shade of the Bill of Rights, the right to vote is very sacrosanct and is one of those unlimited rights. Today, of course, as a nation, we witness the demonstration of my fellow citizens of that right to choose their leaders. Under governments instituted amongst men and women, every government must always seek the authority and the permission of the governed, and that's why voting takes place on a day such as this. What we are witnessing now, by way of, say, the NASA movement having elected to abstain or abscond this election, and the other Jubilee and the other players choosing to go to vote, demonstrates that as a country, there is some critical importance that we afford to the place of democracy. And this is very clear. While we know very well that even as there is the calmness witnessed or evident across the country, that our electoral challenges, our democratic issues, are still, in fact, stirring up. Today, one thing that must come clear to all our leaders is that our people listen to them. The people of Kenya listen to their leaders, and that now the leaders must afford this country an opportunity beyond today to now see how they can iron out the institutional and governance and electoral issues that we still have. Because we all know for a fact that after the voting today, after the counting of the ballots, we know very well that by way of the decision of NASA, there is still so much that needs to be handled, because the electoral challenge actually is now even more enormous. Because one wonders, for example, by way of the declarations yesterday by the NASA leadership, that now a new movement has been birthed. What does that connote to this, that decision, to the people going to vote and the outcome of that vote? And so the greatest appeal would be to the President Kenyatta, to NASA leader Raila Odinga, to see now how to, by moving forward, to avoid the kind of stirring up of emotions across the country that we've had, which actually has set in lots of confusion. That confusion is still there.
All right. And let me come to you, Dr. Mukhwana, and look at the strategies that we have here. And I think we have two main strategies. We have Jubilee with the strategy of we must have the elections as per the Constitution, then we shall resolve whatever issues that we have later on. We have NASA on the other end who have said, you know what, we're not going into this election. In fact, they now have come out and said that NASA is no longer just a political party, but it is a resistance movement. First of all, what is a resistance movement? Because that, it has been interpreted differently, but there are those who say a resistance movement is an organized effort by some citizenry to resist the government. Your interpretation of possibly the two strategies?
I think without confusing our viewers, let's give it a plain definition. When you talk of a resistance movement, it is simply that it is formed to resist a certain part of what is in the system that they do not agree with. So it is a resistance movement. Plain definition, without going into political science or whatever. But what then you attach to that resistance is what matters. And that is why last evening when I was on the Kiswahili show, we had a spat with the host because she felt that resistance movement should be called vugu la uasi. And you see, uasi means rebellion. And when you use the word uasi, it connotes a kind of armed, contrary to the law kind of organization.
But isn't resistance by virtue of just that word rebellion in a way? Because you're resisting whatever the government has. It is rebellion in some sort of way.
That's what I'm coming to. The plain definition gives what I've said. The context then will metamorphosize with time. For example, they haven't given us the agenda. What is it, apart from the name? The name itself connotes that, yes, it's a resistance, it could lead to a rebellion. But what is the context of this name? Because when they call themselves the NASA resistance movement, in the context of the politics of this region, straight away, the analogy goes to the Yoweri Museveni's NRM. And the next analogy is the National Resistance Army. And that is why Kenyans were so quick in linking the NASA resistance movement to the armed struggle of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni. The question is, why did they use the name resistance movement? Because Raila is not a fool. I mean, Raila is one of the most decorated politicians in this country, if not the only one. So for me, at this level, until I read their manifesto, until I get to know what it is that they are calling this national resistance movement, I want to act the saint for now and say it is a movement that has been formed to fight against what they perceive to be injustice, against what they perceive to be the electoral ills, how, in what manner, what modus operandi they'll opt, it's something that I can only be comfortable commenting authoritatively after things develop.
Javas, are we going to sit here like that? I mean, part of the reason for analysis is to try and weigh in and see what could this resistance be. Now, Raila is on record as he was making this announcement on saying we're going to resist anything that the government has. That would leave the citizenry thinking, and I guess that's why we are here to analyze, thinking that maybe it's resistance for anything, good or bad.
I will not...
By virtue of the fact that the government, according to NASA, is not legitimate.
One, I wouldn't wish to be coy about my reflections on this, NASA resistance movement. And I don't want just to give an X-ray of that which they pronounced themselves on yesterday. Perhaps I would give a scanned, reflection on the same. One, that by way of them just having declared a resistance movement, should not have us be shy to reflect deeper and look at what are the clear, veiled, and even overt ingredients of this resistance, and what are the pillars of this resistance, what is the direction that this movement is likely to take, and what is the potential or likely outcome of this movement. Now, we know very well by demonstration of history across the continent, we have had UNITA, we have had Frelimo, and all these kinds of movements. You have got the NRM of Yoweri Kaguta Museveni, and now the resistance movement of Honorable Raila Odinga.
NASA resistance movement.
The resistance movement. Of course it is his, because he's the leader.
And by the way, while we're still looking at that, remember there's still Orange Democratic Movement, a movement again
Yes.
within
What did he call it?
NASA.
NASA resistance movement.
No, before Michael corrected.
I said the Raila Odinga movement, resistance movement, because he's the leader. All right? Now, the thing is this. We know very well that there are various dimensions that are going to come off. This resistance movement is likely to take a social angle, economic angle, political angle, obviously. And what everybody then would fear is whether it will take some kind of militant angle, militaristic perspective to it, which, of course, we know very well that under our laws, that itself
is not allowed.
Actually, it will, plunge this country into, the abyss that we do not want even to imagine. Now, the thing is this. By way of their pronouncements yesterday, they talked about listing or enumerating some of the commodities and products that they want their supporters to boycott. But one thing, of course, we know very well that they're trying to tether the elements of that movement and its aspirations to even the civil rights struggle and the kind of boycotts that even Martin Luther King Jr. urged his supporters. But the thing is this. Are there alternatives that the NASA movement will provide to its supporters when they're boycotting all these products? When you talk about, for example, whether it's food products that you say that they are aligned or, we know very well that
benefit from the Jubilee government.
The Jubilee government or its affiliates, etc. But what about the supporters of NASA who today, their office premises are buildings owned by those individuals who are affiliated to Jubilee?
Or maybe even employed by some of those companies.
Yes. How about those who live in houses that are owned by those individuals? Are there alternatives that NASA is going to provide? These are some of the challenges that the NASA leadership needs to think through before they just pronounce themselves on these issues of boycotts. Because you are not going to have selective boycott if at all you are on an all-out struggle. If you're boycotting everything affiliated to, then you go on an all-out kind of boycott. But what is the wisdom of this altogether? Today, we know very well that as that movement has been birthed, of course, to the excitement of some, to the chagrin of some, and even some NASA supporters may have recoiled now, wondering what direction now this is giving to them. Because we know very well that going by the history of our continent, resistance movements are never quite too peaceful in the end. And as Daktari has indicated that, well, he's waiting for the definition and guidance and the manifesto of NASA to see how this movement is going to be. Let us appreciate one fact, that in any democratic enterprise, the people need to feel secure, liberal, and protected. The pursuit of happiness. When, for example, Thomas Jefferson, at the age of 33, quipped and wrote in timeless words that all men are created equal and are endowed by the Creator certain inalienable rights. Amongst them is, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Question is, this resistance, to what extent will it lead the NASA supporters to that liberty, to the pursuit of happiness, and whether it's going to create a rift by those who do not align themselves to that movement, and whether those who are not aligned are also going to pursue the tenets of liberty and the pursuit of happiness.
All right, let me bring in Nerima here. And Nerima, you are unique in the sense that you represent a number of constituents. One, women, and secondly, the youth. Now, looking at these strategies, both by Jubilee and NASA, what are your thoughts on Jubilee's strategy of let's have this election done as per the Constitution, because we have to do it within the 60 days, then let's resolve issues later? Because one of the things that we must admit is that this temperature or this atmosphere that we have had of electioneering for over a year has definitely affected us negatively. Maybe, like they say, growth is painful, and sometimes for a child to grow, they have to fall and get bruised. And maybe that's the growth we're going through as a democracy. But representing the youth and women, what are your comments on the strategies being used by both sides?
Well, first I have to comment on something that Javas has just said in terms of quoting Thomas Jefferson in All Men Are Created Equal. George Orwell in Animal Farm, he mentions all men are created equal, but others are more equal. Okay, so that's a whole other discussion altogether. However, to talk about resistances, I think we forget that they also bring about change. If it wasn't for the civil rights movements and resistances, Black people in America wouldn't be able to have the rights that they have. If it wasn't for the women's movement, women today would not be able to vote in 1883 when Iron Ladies, that's where that first term came about. So at the same token, we can even think about Mahatma Gandhi in the Indian movement, where he refused for his people to manufacture or use salt. That affected the British colonizers. So movements do bring about change. They're not always constantly negative. And those are the things that I'd like to bring about. However, as young people, there's a lot of confusion. Most of us have no idea what is happening. A lot of us are fatigued and tired. Quite frankly, to mention those who are not voting today do not necessarily support NASA. They're just not voting because they don't feel that their vote counts. When you have Chebukati saying a few weeks before that he cannot, guarantee a fair and credible election, then why am I going to vote? What is the point of it? Because a whole sense of a democracy is for your vote to count, for it to be credible, and it's a competition. So when it's already felt that it's an unfair kind of competition, do you really feel that you're winning anything? What it's doing is even creating more of a divide. And I think what we're going to see now is people who could be Jubilee supporters, but they feel exhausted. And at the same time, they also feel that this could have been handled better in terms of not necessarily being pushed into an election because of a time limit. What we're trying to show young people is that it doesn't matter whether what you do is right or wrong. It can be wrong, but you've done it in time. Is that some of the attributes that we want to instill in our young people? That the process is no longer important. I frankly feel that the whole essence of our democracy is crumbling. Because if at this moment in 2017, I feel as a young person my vote does not count, why should I come out in 2022? Someone else has already made that decision. What's the point of me going and lining up for hours if the decision and leadership has been made?
All right, Dr. Lutala, let me bring you in here. And this seems to me and to many Kenyans, it's almost like a chess game that's being played by our leaders.
It is.
And literally, you have one moving his, whether it's the bishop or the castle or whatever, I don't know if you play chess, but at the end of the day, we the citizenry are the pawns. And normally you sacrifice the pawns to save the king. Are we in a situation where we literally are being played chess? And secondly, if the power is with the people, as per the Constitution, what is our responsibility at this point in time? Because here we have one giant saying that let's vote, and that is your democratic right, and we'll sort out the difference later. The other one saying, no, let's not vote because it's not legitimate. What's our responsibility? Where do we fall?
Michael, I almost said that I have nothing useful to add, because you captured it right. You captured it right. It's a chess game. And for the numerous shows we've had here, we've kept on seeing each development from one side, the other one coming to outdo the other, sometimes deliberately circumventing the known law to try and achieve that objective. And the last time we were here with Professor Oeri Tumbo and Mheshimiwa Kioni, we agreed that what has now happened is that whatever strategy that NASA is taking, it's meant to counter the Jubilee strategy and vice versa. What we are seeing now, particularly with the formation of the national, NASA
resistance.
Sorry, we'll get used to it.
No, we'll get used to it. Even NASA, when it started, was a bit of a problem, but there you go.
Sorry about that. Yeah, so the NASA resistance movement is the latest shift in gear by the Raila team to outmaneuver Jubilee. Because remember, Jubilee has outmaneuvered NASA when it came, number one, to the issue of the election laws, which they were quickly passed, though not signed yet, I don't think it has been signed into law, but which has been used effectively as a swinging sword on the neck of the NASA guys. Then NASA went into Mandamano, which again pushed Jubilee onto the wall. What Jubilee successfully did is there are 4 commissioners in IBC who have apparently outmuscled the two, because we know that by courtesy of Dr. Kombe and Chebukati and the insights that are happening. And because Jubilee has outmuscled NASA and they're going to an election without the requisite reforms that were asked for, NASA has decided, very well, you'll have it, but we'll not be there. Now, Raila has now come up with something that will make him to metamorphosize into a shapeless form. It's a new shape, but it has no form. And for me, that is the next frontier of the battle. If you...
Creating the form.
Yes.
Giving us the form and the context.
Precisely. If you look at Raila history, even when he has appeared to be at his lowest, Raila has somehow recreated himself, including actually dissolving his own party in 1997 and joining KANU. When you think he's dead as a dodo, that is when Raila flourishes the best. And this terrain that he has pushed the government into is a terrain that only him is familiar. President Uhuru and William Ruto cannot operate in that terrain with the dexterity that Raila, the revolutionary, can play. For us as citizens, because that's your question, what should we do? Unfortunately, there isn't very much we can do. And you can use that voter in Bondo who said, why is he not there? Because he was told not to be there. I'm sure if you sample those in the Jubilee stronghold, they'll tell you, we're here because we were told we have to exercise our democratic right by our leader. So whereas you and I can pontificate here, we can argue and reason. Unfortunately, the bulk of the Kenyan population does what their leaders tell them. And Javas was right when he said that the two must now realize that they influence what happens in this country. So the only prayer that I have for Kenyans is, whatever it is that we do, let's respect each other.
Okay.
Let's be peaceful. Let's listen to our leaders, because I'm not sure if I told them not to listen to Raila, I will succeed. And not listen to Uhuru, I will succeed. But my prayer is, whatever it is that we do, let's remember that this country belongs to all of us. And 2, even if you listen to your leaders, remember that you cannot do without each other. And that is why, if you allow me, when Javas talks about, because he went into the merits of whether this strategy by NASA in terms of boycott will work or not. I hope we have time to deal with that. But the truth of the matter is that it is a terrain that is slippery. But that's what Raila has always done. He comes up with a strategy that looks like it is going to be the last nail in his political coffin, including when he resigned from Parliament, the first MP to resign from Parliament, and go under a new party.
Actually, you know, many were saying that it was his last bullet, but it looks like his gun is not running out of bullets.
Exactly.
It just seems to be getting rounds one after the other. Nerima, let me come to you. And the youth are definitely what Kenya would expect and hope have a future for this country, especially in terms of learning. Do you think we're learning from history? Because when we look back and see how things are happening, just like Daktari has mentioned here, if you remember the promulgation of the Constitution 2010, many went to the streets, and if you ask them what is right or what is wrong with that Constitution, some would tell you, Baba has said it is okay, so we're not even going to read through it. Now, the question here being, Are we learning from history, and are we able to articulate for ourselves, rather than to be balkanized by tribal affiliations just by virtue of the fact that our leaders have put us in those cocoons? Are we getting out of those cocoons by virtue of learning?
That's a difficult question because it depends. There are youth, youth you cannot cluster us into one. The age between 18 to 34, we're 19 million who can vote. Yeah, so we count for 51% of the voting bloc. However, when you have these discussions, you will find that at the end of the day, we retreat. We go back to who the family says we should vote for. However, there are still some family members where they are being called rebellious for having another thought, for thinking about voting another candidate. And a lot of us, even me, I've been told, you know, you're wasting your vote if you're going to vote for that particular candidate. However, we have to remember the study that Aga Khan University did that said most youth are not tribal. But where does that come from? It's simply because when we have a friend, for instance, if you're in university, you don't ask their second name. I'll ask and find out what your first name is, and then I'm not concerned about your second name. However, as soon as you go home and introduce that friend to your parents, they ask, what's the other name?
And where do they come from?
Where do they come from? So you see, we still have that from our parents, but our generation is becoming less and less. However, when it comes to politics, we have a lot to do in terms of understanding our history. Even our own history in our education doesn't cover it in depth. When you have them talking about the Kapenguria 6 or even before colonization or understanding the whole mentality of how missionaries used clan elders and councils and things like that, we're not taught that. So even this whole issue where we're talking about tribalism and why we're so tribal, it has been there since independence. It's because of how people regrouped with the Mau Mau in terms of leadership. And a lot of people talk about the whole reason why Odinga doesn't deserve is because his father was given the opportunity and he decided to wait for Jomo Kenyatta to get out of prison. He was not going to take that position when he was VP. So a lot of these discussions, a lot of young people do not know, and that's why there are different mediums and avenues to learn and talk about our constitution. We're still a little far away from issue-based politics. When we see that we're still representing or nominating and electing representatives who have no experience at all, but we go according to their personality and attribute and how they speak at campaign rallies, but there are no issues.
There are no
it's
issues
basically
that are
insults that are going back and forth, and they have fun with it. So those are the conversations that we as young people need to now begin to have, because the issues that are in place, when we talk about the majority of young people, above 40% are unemployed. I mean, no jobs. And then we're talking about people graduating yearly up to 1 million. It's going to get us to a point where these problems are so drastic, because we're talking about high food expenses, from milk to bread being expensive, from your VAT taxes.
I'll have to pause you there because we need to take a short break. It's now 8:30. This is Kivumbi 2017. Do stay with us. We have more updates coming up and analysis as we continue. We'll also be catching up with some of our reporters who are all over the country, basically giving us updates on what is happening on the ground. Do stay with us.